And oh my God, we're recording. This is Rick Levine and we're recording, but I want to share my screen. And so let's see whether or not that can happen. Share screen. And I think it works if I just, let's go here.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Astrologer conference. And this is like part two, some more. This is the post-retrograde version, right? So we have the opportunity to have Rick Levine back with us with an absolutely engaging conversation about kind of being this detached observer in your astrological practice. So Rick, super thrilled to have you, see you, rescue you, hear your wisdom. It's all over to you now.
All right, here we go. And ready, fire, aim, which is the Aries byline. Ready, fire, aim. We are here today to talk about one of my least favorite topics, but most recurring places where I come back to with deeper and wider questions. This is not a new issue for me, and I'm sure it's not a new issue for anyone who has been doing astrology, sees clients, has any sort of public interface, because the question becomes, how neutral should an astrologer be, whether they're doing client work or whether they're doing global mundane forecasting. And interestingly enough, I have a little story to add to the stories that I'm going to be telling in reference to this conversation. So, and I think before we jump in, I have a couple of photos because many of you were actually here this morning. I don't mean this morning today, in whatever month it is, in October. I mean, today when we were all together back in May in Tucson, Arizona, standing out in the wilderness amongst the saguaro cactuses and waiting for Venus and Jupiter to rise as they were conjuncting. And in fact, they did. And it's not necessarily a great shot, but one can see amongst the cactuses Venus and Jupiter in the eastern horizon, on the eastern horizon. So it was very cool. So I thought we would start there and have a little bit of a flashback. Mallory, are you emceeing or hosting or whatever? I guess you don't have to answer me. I see you that you're a panelist though. Okay, so if there are questions that pop up and I don't see them, I'm absolutely happier taking them real time rather than saving them until the end. So
all right.
Feel free to interrupt me. I'm fully interruptible, if that's a word. Interruptible. Okay, so I lost my screen. There we go. So we really want to start off asking some very basic questions about our role as astrologers. I wonder how many people here in participants that are on chat, how many of you actually see clients, and how many of you actually have some sort of social media presence? If you would just kind of hit that into the chat box, so it would give us a good sense of who's here and what we're all doing, because part of where I'm going with this is something that we run into on a regular basis, and my feelings about it have changed very strongly over the last several years, because the question of what does it mean to be an astrologer really has to do with how other people see us, what role we fulfill in other people's individual lives. And the truth of the matter is, this varies astrologer to astrologer. What part of the magic of finding a place in the world as an astrologer is that we find a place that resonates from our inside out. And from that standpoint, for some people who are very oriented strongly towards either social or global or political issues, or some people who have the strong stake in gender politics or racial politics or those issues. I mean, we are all different. And in some ways, I hope what today's presentation leaves you with is the understanding that no one, including me, is going to answer this question for you, but there are things that we need to consider that it's very likely, unless you've given this as much thought as I have over the years, over decades, you may not have thought some of these things through as fully as I have. And I am, like I said earlier, very far from absolute conclusions. This is an ongoing discussion. So the primary question that sits at the bottom of all of this is, should we as astrologers take a position, or should we strive for neutrality? And I have to say that there are people who come down strongly on both sides of this issue. There is no right or wrong here, as I said previously. However, as you're going to see, I have become, over the years, less and less inclined to fake neutrality when that's not true to who I am. And ultimately, I'm going to come down on the side that of believing that an astrologer has to remain true to themselves, that ultimately will inform where we go with this. And for some people, that may mean being extremely political or opinionated, and for others, it may mean the opposite. The thing is that there have been very specific events that have moved me on this. So I want to share a couple of experiences here. And although the slides that we're using are the same slides that I used when I gave this presentation live in wherever that was, in Tucson, Arizona, that when I say my recent YouTube experience, I've had more recent than the recent YouTube experiences than I reported last time. And so I'm going to bring you up to date with that a little bit. But this does go back to the 2020, the 2019, actually, 2020 presidential election. Actually, it really has its origins in the 2016 presidential election, and I'll tell you why. Because in the fall of 2016, in September, I believe it was, of 2016, there was an ESAR conference similar to the one that was at Westminster, Colorado, just a month ago, 2 months ago. And that conference opened with a panel discussion on the upcoming presidential election. This was, to be clear, the election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And the opening panel was a panel of, I think it was 7 or 8 American astrologers. And the closing panel of the weekend of that conference was a panel that was addressing the same issues. However, they were non-Americans, non-United States citizens. They were of the international portion of the International Society for Astrological Research. The results of that panel discussion were kind of confirmed something that many astrologers intuitively know, and it's something that I've observed certainly over the years. And that is that the astrology community tends to be left leaning, and left, right, these words don't work as well as they once did. But but it seems that the astrology community as a whole tends to lean toward a more either progressive or liberal or democratic in the United States policy than a more either traditional conservative or Republican perspective. And as such, people tend to predict what they believe rather than what they see in a chart. Or let me say this slightly different. People see in a chart what they believe. In other words, we've learned over the years that seeing is believing, but I think it was Wayne Dyer who once said, "Believing is seeing." If we believe something, we see it. And Chital, I don't know if I pronounced your name right. I hope I did. Said, I was there for that conference and panel. I believe there was only one person forecasted a Trump winner. It was interesting to watch. And as a point of interest, the person, without naming names, doesn't matter, who did forecast a Trump win was someone who was a Trump supporter. And those who did not support Trump did not support his win. Now, to be a little bit clearer on this, most everyone on the panel did come up with stuff that sounded like it was evading the issue, but turned out to be more true than false. In other words, there were people who said, well, who wins the election doesn't necessarily seem to be the person who's inaugurated. Something will happen that changes the result. I mean, there was a lot of muckiness about the projections that were less about astrologers giving themselves some elbow room than it was that was part of what that chart said. But as Chital said, the fact of the matter is that on the American side, that basically everyone except for one person forecasted that Hillary would be the person who would win. Now, one can say, well, she did win the popular vote, but she did not win the election, obviously. And similarly with the international. What this confirmed for me is something that, like I said earlier, that I've noted for many, many years. And that is when an astrologer has a certain opinion or a certain belief, he, she, or they can find that in a chart. And a sign of a good astrologer may, in fact, be being able to locate whatever you think or believe in a chart. Now, this is not the formal line of what we learn when we learn how to be an astrologer. So the recent YouTube experience that I'm reporting from last May really turns out to be an ongoing situation. And as many of you probably know, I do a monthly forecast on YouTube that's comes out typically on the first of every month. I've been known to be a day late here or there, but typically it comes out on the morning of the first day of the month. And typically that forecast gets typically between 45 and 85,000 views, somewhere in there. Now, depending on what's going on, I often will talk about current events. And although I don't necessarily grind a political axe, there are times when it's almost foolhardy to think that I can evade talking about a certain event, whether that event is an impeachment of a current president, or whatever else happens to be going on, whether it's a Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe versus Wade, and so on and so on. And my experience is that every time I slip into any sort of political or quasi-political, global, even if it's not, I mean, maybe everything is political, but if I say something about climate warming or, climate change or global warming or whatever it is, um, a minority, a small minority of people can be relied upon to jump all over me, not because of my astrology, but because of my political beliefs or because of my beliefs in general, whatever they may be. And often those people do it. And I say those people, it's not always the same. As a matter of fact, it's never the same person, but someone I can rely on the fact that someone will come out of the woodwork and throw around a lot of nasty names and say if I was a real astrologer, I wouldn't be politically biased. And my response is, or has become over a period of time, that I'm happy. Well, happy isn't the right word. I think political debate is an important thing, especially in these times. But there are places for it. And that my YouTube channel on astrology is not necessarily a place for political debate. It's a place for astrology. And as the host of that channel, it becomes incumbent upon me to keep that clear in that manner. I'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm just trying to lay some groundwork here as to why this is such an important issue. Recently, and often I should say, I will post at the very top when this comes up something about I've just deleted comments on such and such of a topic. And I'm happy to have a discussion about this, but not here. It belongs on a discussion on a site that's set aside for political discussion. And this site is not a place where you can come and get on your political soapbox. I try not to stand on a soapbox too often, although occasionally, because I am human, I find myself not being able to avoid a certain topic. And that tends to upset people quite significantly. This got me thinking over a period of time, and very recently I posted something about the upcoming election, and I don't even remember what it was, but it was on my October forecast. And I had someone basically, I wish I had the post in front of me. I could have cut and pasted. I don't have it, but it basically said how much I disappoint this person because of how carefully and cleverly I couch my liberal, socialist, I don't know, there were a lot of other slurs thrown in there that got nastier and nastier, views. And I couch it in astrology because I'm just like everybody, just like all the rest of them, basically, trying to take away people's guns and take over the world by taking away people's rights, which has nothing to do with what my goals are, but that's aside from the point. So a few days ago, I've been away from Seattle for almost a month. I lectured at Lilydale back in the middle of September, and I'm still in the Northeast. And I spent about a week and a half up in the high peaks of the Adirondack Mountains up in Loon Lake. And I did a little video for my patrons that I do videos that are subscription based. And actually, and I'll say right here, right now, that if anybody wants to watch the video that I'm referencing right now, send me an email to rlevine@stariq.com, and I'll send you the link. It's a unlisted video that only is distributed to my Patreon subscribers. But I'd be happy to share it. This is a small group. And thank you, Mal, or whoever just posted my email address. Send me an email, Stormy. Thanks, Stormy. Send me an email saying that you were at the OPA event and you'd like, it's a 15-minute video. But I got pushed to a point if I felt like I needed to make a statement. And my statement was really to my Patreon subscribers. And it was not to stir up a political debate. It was to stir up a discussion about whether or not astrologers should keep their political views quiet or whether they should be in the front of the storm. And that's not in front of the stormy, where I would always enjoy being, but is storm. Okay, anyhow, thanks, Stormy. Terrible joke, I know. Sorry for that. So this was just absolutely recently. I posted this yesterday, and it stirred up quite. I mean, the comments that have come back overnight are really well thought out, very, very detailed. And I must say that most of the people who are at least posting, at least in this group, not surprisingly, are tending to agree with me. I mean, there are people who actually, are vested in following my work, I guess, so they would tend to. Some people don't completely. But let's move on, because this ties into the issue. And I really want to talk about the larger issue of astrologer as observer versus astrologer as participant. And here we actually have to step back in time, because the role of the astrologer has changed significantly. I don't know if anyone here, if many of you know of the work of Marshall McLuhan, who is considered to be like the media guru of the late 20th century. And McLuhan is the guy. He wrote the book, The Medium is the Massage, which actually was a pun on The Medium is the Message. And he wrote a book called War and Peace in the Global Village, the first person to use that term of the global village, of the earth having shrunk to that size. In fact, he was a very brilliant man. And one of the things that he commented on in one of his books was that the role of the artist historically was to be in the ivory tower while they perceived what was going on in the social realms, in the cultural social realms, and reflected that. That was the job of the artist, was to perceive, to be separate from society, and to perceive and reflect through the art of the individual. However, McLuhan said that things are changing so fast now that the artist has moved from the ivory tower to the control tower. This is a very interesting thought. And if you think about the role, of poets, of filmmakers, of musicians, certainly the role of music in the 1960s and beyond, we can see how the musician or singer-songwriter actually became part of the agent of social change, rather than just simply the observer and the reflector of it. So it's my contention that there has been a larger shift that is part of even a grander shift. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, you know that a lot of my work is predicated on the shift from what we would call Newtonian, Isaac Newton worldview to either Einsteinian or quantum worldview. And in the Newtonian worldview, we observe what's out there. This is the idea that nature is perceived at a distance. Man is separate. I say man, I mean humanity is separate from nature, and needs to control it, or needs to whip it into shape, as the patriarchy that we're hopefully moving out of has embraced. Whereas in the realm of quantum physics, the concept is that if you observe a subatomic event, that your very observation of it has changed it. And this is really key to understanding the astrologer's role in a client's life, because again, going back into history, if you were to go see the Oracle at Delphi, you would make that journey, you would sit there, and the Oracle would tell you what was going to happen in your life. It may be couched in riddles, but basically you were there to hear what your future would be, and then you left, and then your life fulfilled that future. We know that astrology in the 21st century has largely moved away from the idea of prediction into a realm of co-creation. This is another whole piece of this, but it has to do with the astrologer as participant rather than observer. Because if someone goes to see the Oracle at Delphi, or to go see astrologer Rick Levine or Stormy Grace or Mary Smith or whomever the astrologer may be, the trajectory of their life is not the same as if they had never seen that astrologer, because there is always influence and impact in any relationship. And a relationship between a client and an astrologer is a relationship. And even though the astrologer is observing that person's life theoretically through an impassioned, or I'm sorry, from an unimpassioned, I don't know what the right word would be, from a non-emotional, objective point of view, the fact of the matter is that what the astrologer says has impact on that person. So here we have, I kind of talked about this some already. Again, in Newtonian physics, it's cause and effect, and everything is external and everything is mathematical and calculatable. And whether I watch something being dropped by Galileo from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, or if I don't watch it, it falls at the same speed. It falls at 32 feet per second. That's how it accelerates. And it doesn't matter whether it's observed or not. Yet in the quantum realm, as soon as I watch something, it changes the outcome of what it was. If I hadn't watched it, it would be different. So we like to think of the astrologer as a witness, and in some ways, that's part of our role. When a client comes to us, we witness who they are. We witness what their relationship is with the larger order, the cosmos, the macrocosm, the large, beautiful order, as the Greeks would call it. Incidentally, the word cosm, you may have heard me say this before or read it somewhere else. The word cosm comes from a Greek word, or cosmic. Cosm means order, like things are in order. But to the Greeks, when things were in order, they were beautiful. And so the word cosm also means beauty. And so the macrocosm, the larger beautiful order, or the microcosm, the subatomic realm of that beautiful order, theoretically are the same. The Emerald Tablet, if we re-languaged it, we would say, as the macrocosm, so is the microcosm. Or as is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm, because it's not that the top creates the bottom, or the outer creates the inner, or the larger creates the smaller. The above does not create the below. The below and the above arise mutually, simultaneously. But we as astrologers, as we witness that, our very witnessing of it continually alters and changes the outcome, because it turns out that when we're looking at whether it's the macrocosm or the microcosm, and by the way, the modern word cosmetic has the absolute same origins as the word macrocosm, because a cosmetic to the Greeks was something that brought out the natural order and beauty. Whereas to us moderners, we sometimes think of as a cosmetic as something that covers up the natural ugliness, because we have somehow adopted this idea that the universe is inherently chaotic and ugly, and part of the role of humanity is to superimpose order and beauty onto it, which is a very different starting point than the Greeks had. But either way, so when something is cosmetic or cosmetic surgery or using a cosmetic, it has the same origins as the word as the macrocosm or the microcosm or cosmology. So astrologers have many roles. I mean, part of the thing is that the astrologer is a participant in other people's lives. The astrologer is a witness, but the astrologer is also a therapist. Now, I have to say that one of the first times that I did the OPA process of peer supervision, peer review, I've done this probably about 8 or 10 times, and every time I've done it, it's been a very powerful experience. But one of the first times I did it with a group at Ghost Ranch. I don't know how many years ago this was, in New Mexico, and the group that we had 3 astrologers with psychology orientation. I'm an astrologer with a bachelor's in psychology and very well versed in psychology. I would call myself an astrologer with a psychological orientation. The other 3 people in the group were psychologists who used astrology somewhat in their practice, but they were psychologists with an astrological orientation. I always thought the 2 were the same. They're not. They're totally and completely different. It's what a mathematician would call non-commutative math. 1 + 2 does not equal 2 + 1. Being an astrologer and a psychologist is not the same as being a psychologist and an astrologer. And the reason or the observation has to do with a therapist, because even though an astrologer can be a therapist, these are some of the roles that an astrologer plays. I consider myself not a therapist. I consider myself a catalyst. And in fact, I encourage my clients to have therapists, because in that session where I did with 6 people, 3 astrologer psychologists and 3 psychologist astrologers, I realized that the difference was the psychologists wanted to find a particular subject and then sit with their client through the process of that particular piece of their puzzle. And week by week or month by month, the psychologist would basically help the client process these individual things. I wasn't interested in doing that. As a catalyst, I was interested in a one-time intervention of catalyzing, of bringing all these things up, and then sending my client away and having him or her or they spend the next few years working their stuff out, either in their own lives or with an actual therapist. But it's one of the roles that an astrologer plays as an agent of change, is that of therapist. Well, let's see, there we go. And then, of course, as I just said, astrologer as catalyst. Remember, a catalyst, if you have two chemicals and you mix them together, nothing might happen. But if you put in a drop of a right material, boom, that changes everything. And it catalyzes the event or the change. And that's what I look at my job as. I should admit, so that there's no fakery going on here, I've never been to Burning Man. It's something that I would love to do, but for years, I had every year for 8 years, I had a book due around the 1st of September for Barnes and Noble when I was writing annual books. And then for many years after that, I was still writing dailies. I couldn't take myself off the grid for a week. I've never been to Burning Man, but I do know that at Burning Man, when you go to Burning Man, you are part of it. there are no observers. Everyone is part of the process of creating whatever it is. And I think that we as astrologers need to understand that we live the Burning Man philosophy, and that is that we are not merely observers, that even though we might like to think we are, it's just a chicken shit way of not taking responsibility for the impact that we have on our clients. And anyone who's done astrology long enough, I've been doing astrology for 50 years, okay, professionally for 40 plus years. But I have clients who say, I came across a tape that you made for me. A tape were those old things that we used to record on before we just recorded into digital land somehow. But I have clients who say, I found a tape that you made for me 30 years ago, and upon listening to it, I realized it changed my life. I can't tell you how many times that's happened, not only to me personally, but clients that I get that have seen other astrologers. When a client goes to see an incompetent astrologer, that astrologer can alter the direction of their life. There are no observers. We tend to separate social change from individual change, but the fact of the matter is that all change is personal. There's that saying, all politics are local. All politics is local. I don't know what the right thing there is, but we would like to think of social change as something that's out there. It's social. It's not me. But all social change is personal, because it all comes back to my world, how it impacts me. And each and every one of us has a personal agenda. Well, we can't not have a personal agenda. As we go through life, we sort things out on a personal level. We have to own up to the fact that we have a perspective, a point of view, and a personal agenda. Um, the last book that Carl Jung wrote before he died, called The Undiscovered Self, it's a wonderful read. It's maybe 110 pages. It's a very thin book. But in it, he talks about how politicians will never solve the world's problems, that war will not be solved by treaties, that war will end when the internal wars of every human on the planet are resolved personally. And this has a lot of the same concept behind it as Mahayana Buddhism, that basically says that until everyone reaches their own form of peace, enlightenment, nirvana, whatever you want to call it, then no one can, that no one gets off until we all get off. And this is part of why we as astrologers continue to cycle around and do the work that we do. So it's my contention that working with clients and even teaching astrologies are acts of subversion, that we are implanting concepts and things in people's minds that help them understand that taking the course of least resistance is not necessarily the best or easiest or most growth-oriented course for someone to take. Water will run from a mountain down to the ocean and take the course of least resistance. But if we dam it up in certain places, we can use it for drinking, and then we can use it for watering crops, for making hydroelectric power. And so this idea of using astrology in some ways is helping people understand that taking the course of least resistance is not necessarily the best way to live life. It's similar to yoga, but different, because in yoga, we're also learning how to not take the course of least resistance, how to harness the power of the oxen by using the yoke or the yoga. The yoga is the yoke of the oxen. So in the past, the astrologer's role was basically to tell the king or emperor when to go to war or when not to. I mean, it was a pretty cut and dried. The astrologer was the timekeeper, and and the astrologer's job was advising the timing of actions for the kings and dukes and so on. Although I should say that one of Johann Kepler's great annoyances was that people used astrology to figure out when they were going to get laid or not, or when was a good party time or not. And he hated that concept, and he hated that part of popular astrology, which obviously is still around in this day and age. But what we want to talk about for a moment is why it's necessary to make our agendas conscious, because we all have agendas. And if we keep our agenda in denial, it doesn't make the agenda go away. What it does is it creates a rift in our communication with others, whether it be our clients or students, or if we're writing blogs or teaching online, the people who read or interact or view our material. And yet, when we're not being honest with where we're coming from, when we're not being honest with what our agenda is and being aware of our agenda, then what happens is that our stuff comes across crooked, and people can either get confused or they can make judgments about what our astrology is for wrong reasons. And I'll swing back to this in a moment if we have time. I know we're running close. Yeah, we're good though. So one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is what are our goals? Because we all have goals, and we need to think about how we work with these goals when we're working with a client. Why am I seeing a client? Why do I do astrology? Why am I teaching what I'm teaching? Because in some way they have something to do with my goals. And if I'm not clear about what my goals are, and if I don't tell others what my goals are, then I'm not coming across as 100% with 100% integrity. So a question becomes, and this is really a trick question, because the answer on all of these questions is no, no, and no. And the question is it appropriate to project our goals onto others? And it's not. But others won't know that we're projecting our goals onto them if we aren't clear about what our goals are. In other words, I might have a goal of believing that people should find one person and be happy with that person for their entire life, because I was trained to believe that monogamy was an important concept and that marriage was forever, and therefore every client I see, I make judgments about, even though I may not say anything out loud, but I make judgments about, and I make advice based upon their client, because there's something that is a goal of mine that they may not know about, and I might not even be fully aware of, but it streams into everything. So it's very important for us to become aware and conscious of what our goals are, and then to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to hide behind some veil of neutrality or the illusion of disinterest, or are we going to be honest? Now, there are this is not a black and white issue, because there are reasons and times where we don't necessarily do anyone any value, don't do good for ourselves or anyone else if we're always pushing our goals. But we can't make the decision of whether to push them or not unless we're aware of them. Anais Nin wrote, "We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are." And therefore, even clients, even you could go to 10 or 20 astrologers and ask them what their favorite things are in their charts and what the thing is they hate the most. And you will find examples of what one person hates the most in his, her, or their chart is the exact same thing as someone else likes the most. and so when we make a judgment about this square that is really difficult, we're making a projection, or based upon what we've read or what we think, we're not necessarily seeing it the way they are. We're seeing it the way we are. We bring our values to every session, whether we realize it or not. And the values that we have bias, and those biases impact a complete variety of topics, from very personal to global issues. Those biases, again, relationships and marriage, we all have our own agenda there. Sometimes those agendas change through our lives. We may grow up feeling one way about sexuality and intimacy and marriage, and by our 40s or 50s, we may have a very, very different look or feel about it. And again, we have to be careful about imposing our judgments onto others. We all have assumptions and we bring them to the table. And again, this talk today is not about changing your mind or your mindset. It's not about me telling anyone that their mindset is correct or incorrect. It's simply about becoming aware of them, so we know how to work it and how to step around it when appropriate, and how to own it and talk about it when appropriate. And now this comes full circle to the idea of what is nature, what is reality, and the idea of the particle wave duality. Why particle wave duality? Well, it's the same thing as whether I'm, neutral or have perspective. It's the same thing as fate or free will. And in fact, there is both. Reality consists of potential, of waves, that when I look at them, for the moment that I observe them, they become particles. And so this idea of moving in and out of the places of judgment, I think, is very important. And being aware of when I do that is also very important, but I can't become aware of it unless I become conscious of where I'm at personally. And we asked the question, are planets particles or waves? I've asked this question many times. The fact of the matter is that the moon is a particle if we're looking at it. It's a big particle. I call them BFPs, big fucking particles. Saturn is a particle. It's a BFP. But it's also a wave. Saturn is 3 cycles a century, approximately. Pluto is 4 cycles a millennium. And so this idea of particle wave duality has to do with this whole thing of having cause and effect or none, influencing a client or not. It has to do, in fact, with fate versus free will. And here, the idea is that a particle has a fate, like a billiard ball. This is Newtonian mechanics. In the quantum realm, there is free will, and that we have to understand, again, that if I were to see the Oracle at Delphi, I am not exercising free will. My life is fated, and the Oracle is telling me my fate. These days, we believe in a combination, most people, of fate and free will. And therefore, we have to understand how to move in and out of that particle wave duality. Prediction versus prophecy, prediction and prophecy versus possibility and potential. Now, again, when I'm looking forward in the cultural realm, this comes through in everything that I talk about. We have a big election coming up. Am I going to predict who's going to win the election? Or am I going to go out and work for the candidate that I believe might be closer to my values and get other people to do the same? There are some people who say, well, you're an astrologer, you shouldn't get involved. I would say, I'm a human. It's my responsibility to be involved. Don't have time here to talk about what I would call homeopathic astrology, but for those people who know what homeopathy is, you know that the more subtle the vibration, the stronger the impact. And because of that, astrology in some ways is like the delivery of a homeopathic remedy. If I say the right thing, the subconscious hears it, whether the consciousness of the client does or not. And from that standpoint, I am delivering remedies in a very, very powerful and potent manner, even though I may not be aware of it, and even though the client may not be aware of it. So again, back to the nature of reality, we're looking at a client, we're looking at events, we're looking at the political world, not clearly, not cleanly, we're looking at it through our own sensory mechanisms, what Blake called the doors of perception. Incidentally, that's where Jim Morrison got the name for his group, The Doors. William Blake wrote, if the doors of perception were cleansed, then everything would appear as it is, infinite and holy. So we're basically not talking about technique here. I don't care what techniques you use as an astrologer. I may not even believe the techniques that you use are valid. You may look at the techniques I use and think, well, that's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. Techniques are not as important as process, which is why Opus so much focuses on that process. We have so many different things where we make assumptions, in astrology. And I am strongly of the belief that if we're going to do our job, it's not about getting lost in the technique. It's about understanding the process and instead unfolding our own perceptions so we know what our values are, so we know where we stand. This idea of good, bad planets, good, bad signs, good, bad aspects, these are all assumptions that I think are incumbent upon us these days to work beyond so that we don't make these archaic judgments. Make the unconscious conscious. This is our role as an astrologer, as an agent of change. I mean, the one thing that we can change, according to Buddhists, is our awareness. When you change awareness, everything changes. And I should say that this is, I think, one of my favorite quotations. In theory and practice are the same. In theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're not. And so this idea that we can get all this theory down from so many directions, but as soon as we're sitting in a situation, a discussion about a political candidate, a discussion about global warming, a discussion about a Saturn return with Saturn squaring Mars, whatever it is, the theory that we think we learned isn't necessarily the same as what's happening in the real world at that moment. So that's my little rant. Where does that leave us? I mean, if anything, this is really meant to be, I know we're out of time, but this is really meant to be a preamble so there can be discussion. And I would invite any of you who are interested in this topic, again, if you send me the email, your email address, I will send you the link, which will allow you to get to this thing that I just posted about this topic. It's not quite, I mean, well, it's not a presentation. It's just me talking to my subscribers. But if you have something you want to post, if you have the link, feel free to post it right on the YouTube there, because we already have a pretty dynamic discussion going. So I hope this at least got you thinking a little bit. I think that we're past the days of thinking that we can just remain off in a cave somewhere giving predictions. It doesn't work that way. There are astrologers, modern astrologers, who have changed the name of the game a little bit, who have brought into their practice such a strong political it's not even political, although maybe everything is political ultimately, but perceptions about the world and their role in it. Again, here I'm thinking of racial issues, of gender issues, of environmental issues. And to think that we can be an astrologer and ignore those other issues and just talk about transiting Jupiter coming up to someone's natal Uranus, I think is crazy. That's it.
We got a question. We have a question for you already.
Okay, let's do it.
how can we handle clients whom we know their values are inverse to our own and are probably not a good client match?
Well, a very quick story. Many of you know the work of Robert Blaschke, a brilliant astrologer, was a dear friend of mine, someone who I respected. I respected his work greatly. He was brought up as a very strict Catholic, and he had a period in his life where if he found out a client of his was either in a homosexual relationship or in a relationship with a married person, he'd end the session. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that I would do that. I'm not saying that's a healthy thing to do, but I am saying that's someone who knew what their boundaries were and lived with their own integrity. It's a tricky issue. It's a very tricky issue. I think it's important that we understand that we cannot counsel everyone. That I've had clients where before a session started, just a short conversation is like, you know what, this is not going to be a good match because you're so strongly believing. I hear you saying this, and I can't go there. I could tell stories. There's not enough time right now. The answer is you have to do it with compassion. You have to do it with kindness. And you have to do it as best you can based upon what's going on. There is no one rule that fits all. There's no one answer. Everyone's mileage varies. Everyone's perceptions are different. I have clients actually whose values are absolutely different than mine. And we're both aware of it, and we're okay with that, and we can work with that because we both appreciate what the other person has, and we don't let the differences of those opinions get in the way of the work. People do not have to be like you, but again, you have to be aware of what the differences are. I don't know if that answered the question. The answer is there is no single good answer. It's about communication. It's about being honest. It's about being upfront. It's about saying, you know what, you're talking about a relationship style that I don't understand. I'm willing to hear you, but I have negative stuff going on in my mind because that's not the way I approach relationships. I'm not saying this is something that I would say for me. I'm saying it's possible that might come up. We have different ways of approaching things, and if you're honest about where you're coming from, sometimes that just takes the pressure off, and you can say, I can't advise you on that particular topic because my thinking is so different than yours. That might do it. But then again, that might be an example of a client who you would wish that you had sent somewhere else.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Rick. And yep, there's all of Rick's contact information as well as is in the chat if you guys need more connection there. I don't think that we have any other questions unless you guys are secretly typing while we're chatting right now. But Rick, thank you.
I don't see anybody's secret messages. In fact, I'm not even sure there's anyone really there. I think it's just you and me, Stormy, and a bunch of names, but
That's okay, Rick. I always love spending time with you.
I hope this was of use to some of you. And again, if you want the YouTube, send me an email, reference today's discussion. I'll pop you an email back with the unlisted URL for that particular talk.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.